welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. We've got another episode for you, and it is centering on Penn State's new leader, Matt Campbell. We were back in Beaver Stadium in the media room there on Monday afternoon. Got a chance to hear from not just Matt Campbell, but Penn State leadership as well, the president of the university, the athletics director. We will break down what we took away from that opportunity. Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen will join me in just a bit here on this episode, and we'll work our way through a lot of stuff that we heard, some of the things that we asked of Matt Campbell, and ultimately where things are now moving from a leadership standpoint, from a roster and staff standpoint, as a new era of Penn State Nittany Lions football begins. If you missed it, we came to you with an emergency podcast on Saturday. We'll call it emergency. We didn't scramble and get together on Friday evening for you, but we did gather on Saturday. Mark, Daniel, myself spent more than an hour reviewing the twists and turns of Penn State's coach search that led to Matt Campbell, gave you our initial reaction to the longtime Iowa State leader coming to Happy Valley, about Terry Smith remaining on the staff. That's another topic we'll get into here on this episode. And at that point, we also knew where Penn State was heading for a bowl, the Pinstripe Bowl. We now know their opponent for that game, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the episode as well. But before Mark and Daniel come back on board for this episode, I want to turn our attention back toward Ames. That's where Matt Campbell spent the last decade of his career and really evolved into a tantalizing coaching candidate for a lot of different programs and even some NFL franchises over the years. Penn State is ultimately the opportunity that he makes his leap for. But to get better perspective on what went down in recent years under Campbell's watch and maybe why this move made sense for him, we're going to bring in one of our Iowa State insiders from the 24/7 Sports Network to help us with that conversation. Right now, we bring in Alec Bussey. Alec, good to get you on board. I know your coaching search was pretty much here and gone, already a new leader in place in Ames, but we're going to spend some time talking about the guy who ran the show there for the last decade. You were involved in coverage for the last several seasons, getting to know his tendencies, getting to know about him a bit as a person, as a leader. So thanks so much for finding the time and hopping on with us here in the Lions 24/7 podcast.
No, thank you guys so much for having me. It's certainly a whirlwind. I know Matt Campbell used that word a few times in his introductory press conference in Happy Valley. So it's certainly been a whirlwind. I'm sure the last 2.5 months, 3 months for you guys over at your website were pretty crazy. And I'm certainly going through it right now as Iowa State's experiencing a coaching change, but not a very long search, just a search of about, call it a half hour as they bring in Jimmy Rogers from Washington State to replace Matt Campbell, who I think will do a pretty good job at Penn State.
You and I were chatting as Matt Campbell was making the move over here, and I said, hey, buckle up, be ready for anything, tap into the network, you're going to have a long journey. And then I went and grabbed some dinner, and I got back with you and like, yeah, they got a new coach already. And I was like, okay, well, we just spent 54 days during our process, but everybody works a little bit differently. And Matt Campbell was ultimately the guy who ends that search for athletics director Pat Kraft and Penn State. But before we focus, we're going to be doing a lot of focus on what this means moving forward in Happy Valley. But looking back at Ames, where he was really reaching an iconic status among that sports world out there for the Cyclones, talk us through what you've heard on campus in the last 3-4 days about why Matt Campbell saw this as the move that he couldn't pass up, and ultimately how people are responding to his sudden absence.
Yeah, I mean, I think Matt Campbell felt this was the right time to move for a myriad of reasons. Among them, I think he felt like the resources that Penn State was going to provide him were top notch. I think he is one of the most competitive people that I've ever encountered and had a pleasure of meeting. He wants to win a conference championship. That was his biggest goal when he was at Iowa State, was to bring the Cyclones their first ever major conference championship. They've never won one here. The only time they've won a conference championship, I think, was back in 1912. So he really prided himself on trying to bring one of those here. And I know at Penn State, he's really going to want to bring a Big Ten title back to Happy Valley for the first time since 2016. He's going to want to bring them a national title since the first one since what, the 1990s? Is that accurate?
Some people would claim 94, but you got to go back to the 80s for the last official.
Okay, we'll go back to. Well, I was trying to give you guys some credit. You know, I know I'm a Big Ten grad here. I understand like Penn State's football history, but sorry, I don't know the specific years that Penn State has won its national titles. But he feels that he has the support there to do it at Penn State. Whereas at Iowa State, I think they weren't going to have the resources to provide him to compete at the highest of levels. I think what I was phrasing to people in the time where he was contemplating his decision to potentially leave for Penn State was, Iowa State's not going to be able to compete with the resources that Penn State can offer him, but their goal should be to offer him an opportunity to have resources that are in the top 5 or 6 of the Big 12. And ultimately, are all of those reasons why he left? I think a lot of it probably contributed to it, but I think Matt Campbell is really the only person who knows truly and specifically why he wanted to jump at the Penn State opportunity. I do know there were some personal things going on there that Iowa State athletic director Jamie Pollard shared about why this was potentially the right time for Matt Campbell to move on to Penn State. And then I also just think that his departure here, it's been felt. It's certainly been felt. Jamie Pollard got emotional when talking about what it was like to say goodbye to Matt Campbell after a decade working together. He was caught up in tears, I think, twice. I think you could even see some of the emotion that he was still feeling, even when they introduced new head coach Jimmy Rogers on Monday, that, the Matt Campbell era is over. The fans loved Matt Campbell. He was the coach who gave Iowa State football an identity. He was a coach who made the fan base proud because of results on the field, really for the first time in Iowa State history over an extended period of time. They've had small pockets of success, Paul Rhodes, Dan McCarney in the 21st century, but neither of those guys were ever able to sustain it over a long period. And aside from Matt Campbell's first year in 2016, when they went 3-9, in 2022, when Iowa State went 4-8, he had the Cyclones in a bowl game every year. He had Iowa State playing for 2 Big 12 titles, one in 2020, one in 2024. He led Iowa State to its winningest season in program history in 2024, 10 regular season wins, a win over Miami in the Pop-Tarts Bowl. He won more than half of Iowa State's Big 12 games, literally ever, right? For a conference that was founded in 1996, Matt Campbell has more than half of Iowa State's conference wins. He provided Iowa State fans with a reason to believe that their football program could compete in a conference like the Big 12. And now he's gone. And is Iowa State football back to being dead? I don't think so. But it's going to be a different type of life now without Matt Campbell, who was certainly someone who elevated the program and gave fans a reason to believe that they belonged in the Big 12 and that they could compete at the top of the Big 12.
Iowa State hired Campbell back in late 2015 following his MAC Coach of the Year season at Toledo. He was 36 years old when he made that move to Iowa State. Ends up spending a decade there, as you referenced. Only 2 years where they finished under 500 for a program that's used to finishing under 500 and, quite frankly, well under 500 with regularity. 3-9 that opening year, and then 4-8 in 2022. And they have come back from that 4-8 season to go 7-6, 11 wins last year, as you referenced, and then 8-4 this season. What did that tell you about Campbell? Because I'd assume there were some people when they went to 4-8 back in 2022, and he was the coach of the year 3 times in the Big 12 before that season. But I'd imagine there may have been some people that were thinking, has he hit his ceiling here? And is it just going to go downhill from here? What did he prove in the last 3 seasons to bounce back from that? And how did he navigate the current college football landscape, the NIL climate? Because he was pretty candid with us on Monday during his intro press conference and a breakout session that he had with some local reporters afterwards about the reality of the situation that he faced there. One of the least available NIL, piles of money in Power 4 conference play. That's what he was working with in Ames.
Yeah, one thing, so I didn't cover him until the start of the 2023 season, but I covered another Big 12 school in 2022. So that was really my first introduction to Cyclone football, was in 2022, that year that they went 4-8 that you referenced there, Tyler. That 2022 team played a ton of close games. They had inconsistent quarterback play. Special teams play was pretty poor, particularly kicking. I think they missed 4 field goal attempts and a loss at Kansas in the middle of that season. But they were competitive in every game that entire year, except the last game of the regular season when they went on the road and played at TCU and just got smashed. And that was a TCU team that played for a national championship, and Iowa State really had nothing to play for because they couldn't get to a bowl game anymore. But between the 2022 and 2023 seasons, he essentially revamped his entire offensive staff, revamped his strength and conditioning staff. And by doing that, he reignited life into the program. The defensive staff, a lot of it remained the same, but he promoted Nate Scheelhaus from a staffing position on the offensive side of the ball. I believe he was the receivers coach or run game coordinator at that point in time, to offensive coordinator and play caller. He brought in a new offensive line coach. He brought in a new wide receivers coach. He brought in a new running backs coach. All of those pieces came in at the same time, and it meshed really well with a young quarterback by the name of Rocco Becht, who has kind of given Iowa State, like, he was the heartbeat of the program. And I think he still is. He's not in the portal yet. We'll see if he ends up going in the portal. But Rocco Becht's a winner, man. Like, and Matt Campbell and Rocco Becht have a great relationship. And as much as Matt Campbell was able to get him out of that, I think Matt Campbell would be the first to tell you that Rocco Becht deserves a ton of credit for getting Iowa State out of going 4-8. He, in his first year in 2023, led Iowa State to a 7-5 season. In 2024, they won 11 games, and he was one of the Big 12's best passers. This year, he played with a shoulder injury throughout pretty much the entire second half of the year, and it led to his productivity being at a career low, but they still managed to end the year on a 3-game winning streak after losing 4 games in the month of October. So in 2025, Iowa State started 5-0, then lost 4 games, and then won 3 games. And throughout that process, I think what made Campbell really strong and effective was an ability to hire and an ability to find staff members to realign himself. In addition to the offensive staff, it was a strength and conditioning program that was revamped and rebuilt. And like I said, a lot of this stuff happened before I arrived in Ames to cover the Cyclones. But Max Olson, who was then of The Athletic and is now a writer for ESPN, wrote a really good story just about how Matt Campbell kind of rebuilt all of these things in hopes of having success again. And I would encourage fans to go read it. If you Google it, you can probably find it. But it was a really good look inside of how Matt Campbell built his staff, why he made the decisions that he did. And then I think if you're a big enough college football fan broadly, you can understand why a lot of those decisions probably worked and yielded the results that they did over the last 3 seasons.
Let's talk about the word legacy with him there in Ames. He's going to try to build one here in Happy Valley. It's going to require a lot of games, a lot of wins. But how would you define his legacy? I do want to get in some of the staff stuff you mentioned. I want to talk about some players, including Becht. But as you close the chapter on Iowa State for Matt Campbell, what would you kind of say are the headlines of the legacy he left behind there?
Yeah, I mean, to put it in the words of Iowa State's AD, Jamie Pollard, he deserves a statue here one day. Jamie Pollard said that pretty point blankly on Friday, that no one has done more for Iowa State football in the history of the program than Matt Campbell, right? Like, he deserves a statue. He deserves the field to be named after him at some point. He deserves to be honored and remembered here positively. And for the most part, I don't think the fan base is upset that he left. I think they understand why he left. I mean, they dealt with rumors of his name being linked to various jobs throughout his tenure at Iowa State, really since probably 2019, 2020, 2021. And then it probably took a little bit of a stoppage around the time that, they struggled in 2022, and maybe even a little bit after 2023. It started to pop up a little bit more, but more specifically, after 2024, he was a real candidate for the North Carolina job. He was among the names listed as an interview candidate for the Chicago Bears. And then now he leaves for the Penn State job. He is going to be remembered incredibly well here because of the things I said earlier, where he gave Cyclone fans a reason to believe that they could win in football over a period of time that is significant, because no one else had ever done that, right? Like, in the past, they had coaches who maybe had done it in a very short amount of time, like Earl Bruce in the 1970s. But then Earl Bruce left after 3 or 4 seasons to go coach at Ohio State. Dan McCarney, around the turn of the century in the 1990s to the early 2000s, had 1 or 2 really good years, including a 9-win season that included a bowl win, but he wasn't able to sustain it over a long period of time. Paul Rhodes gave them like 6 to 8 good years, went to a bowl game 3 or 4 times, I believe. It wasn't able to sustain it like Matt Campbell was. You combine all those things, and it's like Matt Campbell's the most successful coach in Iowa State history. He's won more games than any coach in Iowa State history. He led Iowa State to more Big 12 wins, I think, since the start of the 2018 season than any school in the conference. Now, some of that deserves an asterisk because Texas and Oklahoma left the league, but it's still a fact that he did that. He owns more than half of the school's Big 12 wins. Like I said earlier, they have like 15 players in the NFL. All the program's best players ever essentially played under him. he is, for all intents and purposes, like the face of Iowa State football, and he might always be. I don't want to, make a comparison that is talking out of turn, but like Joe Paterno will always be remembered as like a monumental figure in Penn State football. What Matt Campbell accomplished at Iowa State wasn't, in terms of wins and losses, what Joe Paterno did at Penn State in terms of wins and losses, but it was significant for what Iowa State had accomplished prior to Campbell's arrival at Iowa State. So hopefully that comparison kind of helps people understand what exactly it was that he accomplished and why he'll be so revered here, I think literally forever, because he's going to be in the Hall of Fame here someday.
Iowa State and Campbell reached a long-term contract extension before this season that was going to keep him on campus through 2032, averaging about $5 million per year in salary. We'll get into the Penn State numbers a little bit later on the show, but a big jump in that regard. And when you look at the staff, Derek Hoosier is a guy that we're starting to become familiar with now. We heard a little bit about him yesterday during the press conference from Matt Campbell. Really called him one of the better minds in college football, rising talent. I don't know if he's going to technically be called a general manager, but it sounds like that's essentially what his job will be in terms of overseeing the personnel department. What can you tell us about Hoosier, what he did at Iowa State, and ultimately, who are other staff members that you can really quickly draw some lines between them and what's going on in Happy Valley that you anticipate could or should be a part of what he's building here at Penn State?
Yeah, so I'll start with Hoosier. He's someone who went to school at Iowa State. I'm pretty sure Matt Campbell inherited him, but he rose up Matt Campbell's board of employees in the personnel department throughout his decade at Iowa State. And over the last 5, 6, 7 years, whatever period it was, he was essentially leading Iowa State's recruiting efforts. He was the director of player personnel, the GM, whatever the title specifically was before everyone started calling it a general manager. He deserves so much credit for identifying and helping Matt Campbell find talent, acquire talent, retain talent, and develop talent. He deserves a lot of credit for that. He has a staff at Iowa State, or had a staff at Iowa State, I should say, that included Trent Slatnow, who I believe is also going to Penn State. Trent Slatnow is a native of the Des Moines area, which is just about 30, 45 minutes away from Ames. That's someone who I would expect to go with. Trent doesn't have a background of playing college football. I think he played in high school, so a lot of his scouting stuff are things that he's had to work to earn, right? Like he wasn't given an opportunity of getting into the scouting world of college football because he played in college football and he was hired as a GA by the head coach that he played for in college, right? Like he had to kind of, I don't want to say weasel his way into it, but he had to work his way into it. In terms of the staff members on the field that are going with Matt Campbell, it seems to be well reported that defensive coordinator John Haycock is expected to follow Matt Campbell to Happy Valley. I don't know if that will be as the defensive coordinator. I can tell you that from my sourcing here at Iowa State that it was pretty likely he was going to retire before the 2026 season as Iowa State's defensive coordinator. But Haycock did a great job when he was in Ames, especially over the last 7, 8 seasons. He really helped them kind of build and establish their defensive scheme, a 3-3-5 stack that routinely ranked in the top 5 of the Big 12 in almost every major statistical category except sacks, really, because it's not designed to generate a ton of a pass rush. The defense was put into place around 2017, 2018 during an era where everyone in the Big 12 was putting up 80 points, roughly. Not that much, but it was a lot, like 40, 50, 60 points a game. And the defense became really hard for opposing offenses and quarterbacks to attack. And he's a high-level football coach, someone who is about as much of a football guy as you'll ever find. He loves ball. He loves talking X's and O's. And even if he's not the defensive coordinator for Matt Campbell at Penn State, he's going to be very important. He's going to be an important resource. Other people that I think could logically follow him in terms of on the field staff, wide receivers coach Noah Pauley. This was his 3rd year at Iowa State this year. He helped Iowa State recruit Jaden Higgins out of the transfer portal. He helped Iowa State develop Jalen Knoll. Both of those guys turned into day 2 NFL draft picks by the Houston Texans in the 2025 NFL draft. Higgins has turned into a reliable contributor for the Texans this season. I think that Taylor Mauser is a name that Penn State fans should probably get to know. He has been with Matt Campbell since he was at Toledo. Those two are tied at the hip, essentially. Kind of similar to Slot now, where Mauser played low-level college football, and he was able to kind of get his opportunity with Matt Campbell because he knew he wanted to get into coaching, and he sent a ton of messages and called a ton of people just seeking an opportunity when his playing career was done. And one of the only people that got back to him was Matt Campbell at Toledo, and he provided him an opportunity there. He provided him an opportunity at Iowa State, and he worked his way up from a support staff personnel type of staffer into a position coach, and then all the way up to being Iowa State's offensive coordinator for the last 2 seasons. Continuity is something that was really important for Matt Campbell when he was at Iowa State, because I think he felt like inside the walls he had built something pretty special in Ames. And he felt like the culture that they had was something that was really special, and it was something that he didn't want to bring in too many outside voices to mess with, because what he built was something that was working and something that was leading to a lot of success. And whenever they hired a new assistant coach or something like that, it was often from a winning program. Noah Pauley came to Iowa State from North Dakota State. Tyler Roll, who spent 1 year as the program's running backs coach in 2024, came from North Dakota State. Offensive line coach Ryan Clinton came from Northern Iowa, which is a fine program at the FCS level, but he developed 2 NFL draft picks, including a first rounder in Trevor Penning. Their linebackers coach this year, Colby Cratch, worked in the program for a really long time before going to North Texas and then coming back to work for Campbell in a position coaching role. Like, he is, in my opinion, really adept and really strong at making hires and supporting himself with people who understand what he wants to accomplish, and high IQ individuals who want to have success and develop players and people under the same idea and mold that Matt Campbell prioritizes.
Couple more minutes with you before we turn our attention to my colleagues Mark Brendan and Daniel Gallen to discuss what we witnessed and what we heard in Beaver Stadium's media room on Monday. But just to finish with you on the subject of who could follow him from Ames to State College, who are the players? You mentioned Rocco Becht. I mean, how much of a partnership has that meant to the entire Iowa State program the last few years between him and Campbell? And then who are the other players that are just clearly like, yeah, there's a good chance that Matt Campbell's going to want them, and there's a good chance that they're going to want to reunite with Campbell?
Yeah, I don't want to speculate too much on names, just out of respect for those players, but I can tell you that if there was, I guess I would put it to you this way, right? Like, Matt Campbell is going to go to Penn State, and what I would assume is be under some pretty big pressure to win pretty early. Like, they don't fire James Franklin in the middle of the season if it was acceptable to lose the way that they did. And I think the fan base had gotten tired, at least from my perspective, of like losing the biggest games of the year, and then they lost to UCLA and Northwestern. It was like, okay, we're done. Like, it had gotten toxic. That's how I viewed it. Maybe that's wrong, but from the outside, that's how I viewed it. So Campbell goes in there, and now he's expected to win at a high level. I don't know if there's a lot of players that were on Iowa State's roster in 2025 that can go to Penn State and help them beat, I don't know who all is on their schedule. Ohio State is a team that, right, like Penn State fans want to beat. Like, if Ohio State's on the schedule, I don't think there's a lot of players that are on Iowa State's roster in 2025 that can immediately help them from a talent perspective match up with Ohio State, right? Like, that's not how Iowa State's roster was built. They don't have that level of talent available to them. That being said, there are a few kids. I think if Rocco Becht hits the portal and Penn State wants him, I wouldn't be surprised if that's a move that ends up being made. If you're a Penn State fan, you go look at Rocco Becht's numbers this year, and you're like, oh, well, he wasn't very good this year. Why are we going after him? He was hurt. He played through a shoulder injury that led to him wearing a brace really through the last, I think, 5-6 games of the year. His completion percentage has never been overly impressive in his career, but for the first 2 years as a starter, he threw for over 3,000 yards and he threw for at least 20 touchdowns, right? Like, that's pretty productive, right? I think most schools would take that and say that that's a pretty good year for their starting quarterback. I think another name that would be really worth monitoring would be tight end Ben Bramer. He was a freshman All-American back in 2023. He got hurt in the second half of the 2024 season, but was really productive this year for Iowa State. I think he was second on the team in yards. I believe he led the team in receptions and possibly in touchdowns as well. On the defensive side of the ball, I think safety defensive back Marcus Neal is someone who they're really high on. He was one of the few 4-star prospects on Iowa State's roster, and he plays like it. He's fast. He's physical. He doesn't think, he sees, and he reacts, and he goes and flies to the football. I think he has potential to be a really good player. I think he looks like a future NFL draft pick. And if he decided to enter the transfer portal, that's someone that would be coveted not just by Penn State, but I think by a lot of other programs. There's a few other players, particularly on the offensive line. If I think about someone like Trevor Bohr, who played left guard for Iowa State this year, I think he's someone who would be coveted, but I don't know fully and specifically what Penn State's roster looks like in terms of positional balance, scholarship charts. I know it was, an older, pretty experienced roster entering the season because a lot of people thought that they were following the Ohio State, Michigan plans of the last 2 years. But however their roster turns out, like I think there are some pieces that if they hit the portal from Iowa State that they could be interested in adding in Happy Valley. But I don't think if you're a Penn State fan, if you're expecting there to be 25 immediate impact guys or whatever to follow him from Ames to Happy Valley, I wouldn't expect that to happen.
Yeah, I think our expectation is more of a sprinkling of Iowa State standouts inside that two deep next year, one way or the other, as the transfer portal gets rocking. We'll actually have Tyler Calvaruso, our resident recruiting and transfer portal guy, on our next episode to break down some of those dynamics of the new era and where they want to get things on the field. But Alec, let's finish here. When you forecast what's next for Matt Campbell here at Penn State, how do you project his impact and his ability, acknowledging there are more resources? And are there any specific kind of trademarks, whether it's offensively, defensively, culturally, that you think will be a part of the DNA for the Nittany Lions moving forward?
Yeah, I think he's going to win. I don't know if I feel like he's going to win a national championship or a Big Ten title, but I think he's going to win. I think he's going to get them to a college football playoff or two at some point in his tenure there. I think I'm a big believer in the idea of hiring people that do more with less. And like he said to Penn State fans when he was introduced to them in less direct terms, he did more with less for a decade at Iowa State. And I think he deserves credit for that. I think that his accomplishments in Ames are pretty high level. I think a lot of that's going to transition over to Penn State. I think in terms of the way that they're going to play defensively, I think it'll be interesting to see if they bring that defensive scheme over to the Big Ten. Offensively, I think that you can expect pretty consistent quarterback play. I think they're going to want to try and run the football as best as they can. You're not going to see, some of the ultra creative things like Andy Kotelnicki did in 2024 when he had Tyler Warren, but you'll see some creative things, some fun wrinkles, I would imagine. But all things considered, like I think he's going to have a successful tenure at Penn State. How successful? I don't want to quantify it because I don't need a ton of your viewers and your readers coming at me saying you said he's going to win a national title. If that doesn't happen, but I think he's going to win, and I think he's going to be someone that Penn State fans fall in love with over time. And this is, again, just like my outside perspective on Penn State, but Penn State to me is a program and a fan base that seems to care a little bit more about the players that are putting the jersey on and putting the helmet on their head. And I think that's one of the reasons why Matt Campbell was attracted to Penn State. They're not just tackling dummies going out there like they may be at other schools. Penn State fans seem to really care about the guys who wear the uniform and the helmet. And Matt Campbell cares about his kids, man. He cares about his kids a lot. He would cry every year on senior day as he hugged his kids as they went through the line. I mean, fans have probably seen or may see at some point the video of him essentially just like hugging and kissing Brock Purdy on his last day at Jack Trice Stadium. I mean, he's going to ride hard for them. He loves his kids. He loves his family. And he wants to win. And he's a competitive son of a gun. And he's not going to settle for anything less than his best every day.
Alec Bussey, Iowa State insider in the 24/7 Sports Network. Good luck with your new coach over there. You guys did not have much of a search, but you have a new coach. So appreciate you. I look forward to your coverage moving forward. And I'm sure I'll be tapping on your shoulder again the next several months to
sure
try to know more about Matt Campbell. Appreciate you, Alec.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. I appreciate it. And good luck to Coach Campbell.
Turning our attention forward now, as promised, we've got Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen joining me here on the Lions 24/7 podcast. And fellas, you were sticking around for the final few minutes of our conversation with Alec, where we learned a lot more about Matt Campbell and what he may bring to Iowa State. Let's talk about our initial introduction to Campbell, which occurred in the Beaver Stadium media room on Monday afternoon. It was led off by Neely Bendapudi, the president of this university, who referenced, quote, character, culture, community, and excellence as words that stood out in her early conversations with Matt Campbell when she was convinced that he was the right guy for the job. Pat Kraft said, quote, "You deserve a team that plays with fire, passion, and purpose." Matt Campbell delivers that. What did he deliver to you on this particular occasion, Daniel Gallen, as we all sat in Beaver Stadium's media room and got used to a new man at the microphone?
Yeah, I mean, I think my big takeaway from listening to Matt Campbell is that, nothing really surprised me. I think that was, kind of what I liked about it, that he was someone that came in with the reputation of being, a very steady coach, that players coach. I think that came through a little bit. And, he sounded like someone who is ready for this job, is up for this moment, who knows what he's getting into. And that's what I expected. Like, the thing with Matt Campbell was that it had taken him so long to leave Iowa State, and he was only going to leave for a certain job. And he really struck me as someone that was only going to go somewhere if he knew what he was getting into. Obviously, as last week played out, I don't think we were sure what any new coach was going to get into with how things were going. But he seemed very, self-assured, very, he played the hits, had some good name drops, I think paid homage to the past, discuss the present, look towards the future, and sounded like a man who knows this is where he wants to be and has a long-term vision. And I think if we sat down yesterday morning, I think that's what I said I would have expected to hear.
You referenced some hits there thrown in the mix, references to Saquon Barkley, Jack Ham, Joe Paterno, Kyle Brady along the way. He tipped his hat in the direction of James Franklin, Bill O'Brien, the last two head coaches here to precede him after Joe Paterno. And Mark, look, I think everyone was expecting some emotions. We've kind of heard that this is a passionate guy, but really before he even got into his opening statement, we saw kind of a pause to let that emotional wave go over his face and over himself. And he had to take a few times during this press conference to kind of collect his thoughts and compose himself as the tears were welling up in the eyes. He said it's been a whirlwind. And he also pointed out that his mission statement here is part of it, quote, "Discipline at every corner and demand, most importantly, togetherness." What were your initial thoughts as we got to our first read on what will be many opportunities to speak and hear from Matt Campbell in the months and years ahead?
Great insight from Alec. I remember it was 2 or 3 years ago. I was at a establishment in Indianapolis trying to help convince him to join the network with the 24/7 brass. So I'm glad we were able to bring him. That kid's got a future. I'm telling you, he has a really good personality and he's very good at what he does. So, but he talked about it on senior day, how emotional Campbell would get. And you guys know, sometimes I tend to get on that side, but you can't fake that. I mean, you can't get up there. And before he even started talking, you could see the enormity of it for him, with his wife and kids sitting right there in front of him, what this opportunity meant to him. And to me, of that portion of the press conference, that was the thing that stood out to me. I'm glad you pitched to me with that, because there are so many coaches out there who are either robots or who, you don't have to look too far around to see guys who jump from place to place to place and don't really give a damn about where they are. And this man genuinely cares. And when he talked about the pain of having to leave the players that he was with, you felt that. I mean, and he was able to project that, not with some slick talk, and I'm not even talking, this isn't a reference to James Franklin, because I think he's a genuinely emotional guy too. There are other coaches out there, and I think everybody knows who I'm probably talking about, jumping from program to program. But I just love the way he came across. And so my initial thought, I'm there on the side, very close to where they were. And I'm taking photos, and, I see the tears in this man's eyes. And, that kind of hits you, and you're like, wow, this means that much. He also mentioned Matt Millen. Later on, he mentioned Courtney Brown. He mentioned LeVar Arrington. And this is a shot at
Blackledge was a big one. Todd Blackledge was one that he referenced a couple times.
Right. And this is a shot at James Franklin. I don't know that James mentioned that many Penn State players and greats in his entire 11-year run. I'm stealing that from somebody on our board who wrote that. But it's accurate. I mean, this guy knew even though he didn't really have any connections. And later on, somebody had a chance to ask him, have you met these people? He just said, well, no, I'm just telling you straight out. I'd be lying to you if I said I met them. But these people all had an impact on me. Kyle Brady, I mean, I'm a young guy, and this made me feel terrible because he's like, I'm a young guy watching number 81. I'm a tight end in high school. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this guy's even younger than Kyle Brady. He's looking at Kyle Brady as some aged, some aged player. So I thought he hit all the right buttons. I thought he hit all the right notes. And I know we could get into different parts of it, but I think I was struggling to explain what people were telling me about him, about how he's a guy who's hard to dislike. It's like he brings this, there's a certain something there. And I think we learned a lot. I think anybody who watched that press conference, and I've had Letterman reaching out to me, and I've seen Letterman on social media, and I've seen longtime fans. He won that press conference, even though I know that wasn't his goal. He won that press conference by being himself. And I think that was very important.
Yeah, I think sincerity is probably the key word or descriptor of what we witnessed and what we've heard about him, but we saw it firsthand there in some of his commentary. And really that showed up in a big way, as Mark just referenced, Daniel, in him discussing leaving Ames and leaving a decade of work that, they're talking about building a statue of this guy on that campus someday. That's the kind of work he was able to do there. You wrote a story yesterday at Lions 24/7, Daniel, about him embracing the national championship expectations here. But part of the story is, why was this the right time for him to pursue those expectations on another campus? So now that we've heard from Matt himself, now that we've had a chance to process some of these things, what stood out to you in that regard?
I thought it was really interesting when, like, the wind up to his answer about that question of why it was time to leave. And he went back to 2020 and went back to COVID, which I know for Penn State fans isn't a fond time to think about with how that went. But Campbell was talking about how that was really the first pause that he'd ever had in his coaching career. And that, it gave him some time, with his family to think about things, to look at the landscape. And I think, kind of reading between the lines maybe made him more amenable to thinking about what else was out there, what other opportunities might come up. And he said that when he came back that, he had some certain criteria that he was going to look at if he was ever going to leave Iowa State. Part of that was the family aspect, which, I think, he's closer to home. He talks about how his, I think grandparents and great grandparents were from Carmichael's, Pennsylvania, which I had never heard of. I had to get on Google Maps, I think, during his presser to look that up. We know that he's from Northeast Ohio, football hotbed. And I think just that adjacency to family is big for him. The other criteria talked about the people that he would be working with. He spoke very highly of Pat Kraft and Neely Bendapudi, the whole time that he was up there. It seems like they really made a big impression on him, especially considering how quickly this all came together from, sounds like 48 hours basically from, Wednesday night when that first contact is made to Friday night when they announced that an agreement has been reached. And I think the thing that really resonated with people was that, he talked about wanting to go to a place that, was bigger than him. I think that he said that, it's not about Matt Campbell, wherever he goes. And I think for certain segments of the fan base, I think that really resonated. I think overall, Penn State for a very long time has been about the coach. Going back a long time, it's been synonymous with these guys who have been here for, a very, very long time. And so I think that was an interesting insight from Campbell too, is that he wanted to go somewhere where, it's bigger than himself, that he can step in and, make an impact on some of these players. So I thought that was a very, it was an interesting wind up, in terms of him going back and setting it up and then having his three little bullet points for, that decision to leave. I think that offered some good insight into him and what he's all about as a coach.
Monday for Matt Campbell was really being paraded around Happy Valley. His family was with him every step of the way, checking out Beaver Stadium for the first time, speaking with us for the first time, meeting with some influential donors, Letterman along the way. And then he talked about Tuesday being a chance for him to really work his way through the staff, have conversations with as many people as possible, Terry Smith referenced this a little bit earlier on a Pinstripe Bowl press conference that we'll dive into before we say goodbye to this episode. But Mark, all that stuff lies ahead of him, including, getting face-to-face with all these players. And he said how important trust is going to be. And he can't just give people marching directions. He needs to learn from them what's working here, learn from them what maybe isn't working, learn what makes them motivated, what makes them tick, and then try to figure out, who's coming forward with me from this roster, who's going to build something special with me from this roster. All that stuff is going to lie ahead, and we'll be discussing it. But focusing on what we encountered Monday, Mark, what were some other takeaways for you, whether it was something that Matt Campbell said purposely or something that you maybe picked up from the breakout session that was after the press conference with just a few local reporters? What are some things you would think are worthy of bringing to the podcast conversation?
Yeah, just to go back to one of the things Alex said, he talked about that 3-3 stack defense. And, I think that's almost become an albatross for this guy. I mean, it's worked well in the Big 12, but people are wondering how it's going to work in the Big 10. And I bring this up because somebody I respect a lot, when I first mentioned him, they're like, well, they play the 3-3 stack defense, and I don't know how that's going to work in the Big 10. I mean, he said in the breakout session that when he was at Toledo, they ran a traditional 4-man set. He's a former defensive lineman, and he is not against the 4-man set. The reason they ran the 3-3 stack is because they couldn't recruit enough quality defensive linemen to run that. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Who are the most difficult players? You can go out and get good linebackers. They don't have to be physical, freaks almost in terms of their size. They could be like relatively normal sized human beings, and the same thing with DB. So, that was one thing. When he talked about recruiting and the NIL space, which we should probably retitle as the revenue share space, he said this, and I think this is probably something that nearly every coach at a non-traditional power says, but I don't know how we quantify this. But he said that he thought that they had the least amount of rev share money of anybody in Power 4 conferences. And whether that's accurate or not, you get the point. That one of the question was asked, and I'm paraphrasing, how much can you say kind of how much more money Penn State has in these situations? And he said all of it. It's just like so I'm really anxious to see what he's able to do recruiting wise, getting after it, because remember, he was recruiting very good players, not to the level of Penn State, but we're a year removed from him having two receivers go in the first round of the NFL draft, if I don't have that wrong, including the first receiver taken in the NFL draft. So, I mean, he was able to do that kind of recruiting. And when I'm hearing him talk like that, he's not like setting some low bar. They're attacking this. They're going to get after it. And I'm very anxious to see. Everybody's just assuming that, James Franklin, this great recruiter, well, is anybody else going to be able to do it? Well, let's see what, this guy was training at altitude. Let's see what he's able to do with his staff and bringing in Derek Hooger. I mean, immediately I'm anxious to see how they get after it. So those were a couple things. Just in the breakout, the way he carried himself. I mean, you saw it a little bit on the main stage, but sitting in a chair and, at sessions like that, people tend to talk over one another, trying to get a question out and, waiting for the question to be asked, and then kind of, looking and leaning, like body language. I don't know if that's important to people, but to me it is. It means he's paying attention to what you're saying and listening. And I mean, just the way he kind of conducted himself and handled himself among these strangers who he never met, letting a profanity slip here or there, feeling at ease in this room. I just, he came across to me as somebody who's very easy to like. And again, these are all first impressions, but just some of the things I know I'm kind of dominating the discussion here. But instead of like just the, every little tidbit of what he said, I just think expressing or talking about the way he carries himself is important, because people are going to get to know him in that way.
And one thing that I think people took away from that breakout session was him being pretty clear that he is not a self-promoter. It's not something that he really feels all that comfortable in doing.
Can I say so? That came off of a question that I asked, and I said, "Well, why don't you have all this has been made about why he doesn't have an agent." It's like, what? I said, "So hey, Matt, why don't you have an agent?" And that's where he went into that, and he got to the, well, I'm not really a self-promoter, and the entire room kind of laughed, and I don't think he knew why.
Yeah,
but it's so. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but that was a funny part of what happened in that room.
And that's what I heard about him before at Iowa State. Like, he basically, there was kind of boundaries up. He did his thing. At Iowa State, though, there were less conversations to have with powerful people beyond your program who could directly impact your ability to build a national championship contender. So here at Penn State, maybe that's a little bit different. You have to promote yourself a little bit more, promote your program, because some of those checks are going to get written for your program in a different way than what he had at Ames. But I think he has like 2 tweets in the last 2 years. Yeah, he is a really low-key guy when you talk about head coaches at the college football level. And going away from that a little bit here, Daniel, to something that Mark referenced with Derek Hoosier, that was a conversation that Alec and I had during the earlier segment about him playing that general manager role. And something that Campbell really tried to emphasize to us, it felt like, was, look, we're not coming from a campus where we could write a lot of big checks and sway guys. They felt like they needed to be ahead of the curve in their evaluation. It started with high school evaluation. They had to be better evaluators at that. They had to be better evaluators in digging deep into the transfer portal, because they might only get one shot, and they've got to be pretty early in taking that shot. And so seems to think that now they're going to be able to bring a lot of those traits with them, and then marry that to what we know Pat Kraft and this university is ready to provide in terms of putting together a competitive market price for a roster. Daniel, what do you think is the most fascinating dynamic of that? Because I think if you let your imagination run wild and you think about the development piece that they've really proven at Iowa State, and all of a sudden you give them a bank account to work with, that seems to be a mesh that a lot of people across the country right now are really wondering how quickly it can work out for Campbell and the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, I think that's a very fascinating dynamic to play out. I think it ties into what Mark said about when Campbell referenced the wide receivers who were drafted. I think it was, I'd have to relook at the quote, but it was something about, I think, wide receivers from the transfer portal, where they were drafted. And that shows that, they'll find guys from lower schools and, bring them in, coach them up, and then send them on their way.
He said they had receiver and an offensive tackle who were both like outside the top 40 overall in transfer portal rankings for their respective positions, and they both were the top transfer portal products selected in the last NFL draft.
Yeah, and so I think that where your mindset goes with that is, maybe you skip a couple steps in this, that when they are looking at who is available, instead of looking at, being able to look at the money, the situation, all that. Okay, like we like the number, 20 wide receiver and the number 50 wide receiver, but we have to take the number 50 wide receiver because of those circumstances. Maybe like raise the floor of your evaluation a little bit. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but I think it puts them in a position where, when they enter a conversation, with a player that they really like, with someone who fits what they're looking for, they can start with a higher caliber. The whole thing doesn't have to be made out of diamonds in the rough. You can still, take some swings on those types of guys. I think that they showed that, someone like a Jaden Higgins, I think Penn State would have loved to have him, these past couple of years. And I think that he probably would have been able to do some good things in the Big Ten. But, I think that it allows them to start, maybe from square 3 instead of square 1, whatever metaphor that you want to use. I think it's going to be really interesting, when they get here, when they enter this region. I think that the way that Campbell framed it is the 6 to 8 hour radius and the quality of talent that is here. I'm really interested to see, when these first couple offers come out, when they really, I guess, sink their teeth into this 27 class, who are the guys they are targeting? Where are they from? Where do they stack up? And I think that it's going to be interesting to learn the type of profile that they're looking for. But I just keep thinking about how, like, if you want to sell coaching and development on the recruiting trail, this is going to be a really, really good group to do it. And then if you couple that with, hey, here's a nice check, the type of player that can look at that and think, okay, I can go get coached up, get developed by these guys, and also get paid nicely along the way. I think that you can make a, potentially very appealing landing spot, for some different players. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of you see it a lot, especially usually you see it with, coaches who are moving up from the G5 to the Power 4, in terms of, hey, like, this is what they were able to do at this, smaller situation. Let's see what happens when you level it up. But now we have someone coming from another P4 institution, seeing what they can do. It's a fascinating dynamic for sure.
And I think I've noticed in the last few weeks, there's been a bit of a misperception on how well James Franklin was recruiting at Penn State. Top 5 to 10 classes have not been his standard. It's been more top 15 to 20 range classes, national rankings on signing day. Now, he had a big time class in 18, big time class in 22. We saw how those paid dividends in different ways and produced NFL talent in different ways. But this is not a staff that was just churning out top 5 ranked classes and keeping up with Ohio State on an annual basis in that regard. So there is some room, I think, to take a step forward. And I also think that you're not exactly needing to take a huge step back because you lost James Franklin. He is the face, and that showed through in some significant ways when 11 guys went and signed with Virginia Tech, who used to be committed to Penn State. But with Matt Campbell here, I think you're in a pretty good spot in acquiring talent, building classes, and we'll see how quickly they can get off to that start. Pat Kraft, outside of Matt Campbell, was probably the person that we were most curious to hear from on Monday, Mark. He did reference some twists and turns as being part of this process. He said when him and Matt Campbell finally connected, and as Daniel said earlier, that was Wednesday, late Wednesday apparently, versus way earlier and what was a 54-day process. He said he was banging his head against the wall, wondering why they didn't connect earlier. We're going to get a lot of second and third hand. We continue to about what went maybe wrong, where things stalled out a bit with Pat Kraft. And I'm sure we're going to hear those stories rehashed for years, maybe less often if things go well for Matt Campbell here. But Kraft himself pulled a line from what I feel like must have been mentioned in our hot board coaching search thread at Lions 24/7. He said this will probably be featured in a Netflix documentary someday. He was saying that in jest, but clearly he understood, Mark, that a lot of people were watching this thing and wondering what the hell was going to happen. And at the end of the day, they got themselves a very good coach. But Pat Kraft, through this process, developed some questions in his angle. But I think he carried himself yesterday like a guy who was all's well that ends well kind of mentality.
Well, yeah, I mean, I mentioned it last week, let's see if he can pull something out of his hat, a rabbit out of his hat. And I wasn't really meaning his hat. But I give Matt Campbell all the credit in the world because I think he almost sent Kraft a lifeline when he was asked about this. And he said he was so focused that he never wants to talk about coaching searches during the season, and I credit to that dude for saying that. But it was criminal that Pat Kraft waited until last Wednesday to get on the phone and connect with this guy, or at least have feelers out there to let him know. And I think he is very fortunate that this guy is the dude that he is and did not take offense that you went through all these other candidates before coming to somebody who, I mean, there's no doubt, absolutely no doubt in my mind, and I don't know if you guys agree, that this guy was way, way, way above some of the people, some of the names that we're hearing about. And I just I can't comprehend. And again, we've heard stuff. What could we verify? I don't know. But at the end of the day, it worked. And this is where I would have to give Neely Bendapudi a lot of credit because Campbell talked to Kraft Wednesday night, and then he talked to Neely Bendapudi, President Bendapudi, Thursday morning, early Thursday at some point. And I mean, you can imagine those two conversations. One, you have this hyperactive guy dropping F-bombs probably every other word. And then you have Neely who's like just mild mannered. And maybe he thought somewhere in between, but between the two of them, they got the message across. I mean, to a good guy and to a good coach. So as you said, all's well that ends well. And I still think, even with the apology, that Pat Kraft, and I'm just telling it the way I see it. I mean, I think he still has to be very careful about how he handles himself moving forward. You know, that leaked audio, even though there were people who agreed with some of what was said, some of the other things that were said in there should never, I mean, I don't even know why he was going in some of those directions. So he apologized. I think everybody ought to accept his apology, but I think moving forward, he's got to be real careful because that was I think he ended up landing on his feet somehow, and credit to him for doing it. But again, I'm just calling it like I see it. I mean, that could have been a complete disaster, and it wasn't. And Penn State ended up being in a good spot at the end of the day. So as you said, Tyler, all's well that ends well.
Yeah, best thing that happens for Pat Kraft now is they go win a bunch of football games in the next few years with this guy as the head coach. And we covered some ground on that leaked audio on our Saturday podcast, so we won't rehash all of that, but we had some commentary on that one in case you missed it on Saturday. Daniel, as we kind of turn our attention forward, of course, Terry Smith will remain the interim head coach. We talked about it last episode. He's sticking on the staff in 2026 and beyond. He's going to be one of the highest paid assistant coaches in college football. And he's got an opportunity to continue building on the roots that he's established here as a player, as an assistant coach. And, you know, he was pretty forthright with us on Tuesday morning during a Penn State Bowl press conference that you and I were part of. It was broadcast on the Yes Network. We're getting ready to go into Yankee territory up there. So get ready for all the Yankee stuff happening. If you're not comfortable with it, just get used to it for a few weeks here. Daniel, what stood out to you when Terry Smith was asked directly about the fact that Matt Campbell's now coming in as head coach? And on top of that, you know, I threw it out there. What did this mean to you the last 2 months or so of this process? And he said it has been essentially the highlight of his career.
I thought it was interesting that I think it was when you posed it to both Kraft and Terry Smith about getting to this point where the framing of it was that, you know, they were on the same page, more or less. Which I think in terms of some of the reporting, you know, some of the, you know, maybe commentary from the players, those things, you know, there's at this point, as we kind of decompress and, you know, debrief, I think that there's, you know, certain things that, you know, are interesting in hindsight and are interesting to hear now based on what we were hearing at the time. But I think overall, I mean, you know, Terry Smith talked about it where, you know, it came through that he's someone who, you know, cares a ton about Penn State and that, you know, it's a place that he wants the best for. You know, he said that, you know, the past however many weeks were the best of his career. And I think that that's, you know, good perspective to have from someone who, you know, I think that week in October, we felt like he was being put into a, you know, pretty impossible situation. And then, you know, the things that we were saying after that Indiana game and the way that we thought things were going to go after that game. I mean, he deserves a ton of credit for getting Penn State to this point. And I think that it shows something about his personality and his character that, you know, through all these ups and downs and, you know, through, you know, however that, you know, emotional swing must have been, you know, after Nebraska, you know, really putting yourself out there in that way and then things going the way that it did, you know, for him to look back so fondly on this time, I think it's pretty neat. And I think that, you know, I think about the quote from Campbell or Kraft, I forget which one was that, it was critically important to keep Terry Smith around. I mean, I think we were saying it, you know, October 13th, where it was, yeah, whoever the new coach is, first call needs to be Terry Smith, you know, keep him on board. And I think it was appropriate that was the first name that really came up as being a, you know, permanent member of this staff moving forward. We'll see how Terry Smith, you know, goes out for his last game, his seventh and final game, being the interim head coach. Can he get his record above 500? Who will be playing for him? Who will be coaching for him? There's a lot of different questions, but I think that, you know, this morning, the way that he talked about things, he's keeping everything steady. You know, he's a competitor at heart. He wants to win. And I think that is really what has helped drive Penn State forward during his time as the interim.
And both Smith and Campbell referenced when he was a head coach at Gateway High School, doing a lot of successful things there in Western Pennsylvania at that level. That former Toledo coach, Matt Campbell, was knocking on his door and recruiting players out of that program, trying to build relationships. And they hit it off pretty well. They had a good working dynamic, good relationship as a college coach and a high school coach. And it sounds like there was a lot of mutual respect already in place. And once Matt Campbell became the guy that Penn State was clearly zeroing in on down the stretch last week, Terry Smith said he knew they were close with somebody. He didn't know who. But as it became clear, Matt Campbell was the guy. He met with Pat Kraft. They went over some things. It was a pretty transparent conversation. Matt Campbell really wanted to prioritize keeping Terry Smith on campus. Terry Smith felt good about that. And so here's what you've got, and a collaboration that could be very effective in keeping talent on campus, bringing talent to campus, and then ultimately putting together plans that work for you next Saturday when games arrive. We spent a lot of time on Terry Smith last week, Mark. So any kind of final words on this subject? There's going to be more chances to talk about Terry in the next couple of weeks. He's remaining in charge of the program as they prepare for Clemson. But now that we've gotten through this very important juncture of the timeline and what Penn State's going from the Franklin era to whatever came next, to know that Terry Smith is still on that train rolling forward, what do you think it means to everyone around here?
I just think the way he handled himself with such class, dignity, all those things through a very difficult time. And even though he clearly wanted the head coaching job, when he didn't get it, to be able to say, you know what, I still want to be a part of this. And after meeting Matt Campbell and being able to get to not meeting in person, but knowing who he is and maybe talking on the phone, I just have all the respect. I had all the respect in the world for Terry Smith before, and I have more respect for him coming out of this.
Couple of housekeeping items here that normally would lead off a podcast episode like this, but get buried a little bit considering what we've been dealing with this week. Ty Howell reportedly will be joining James Franklin at Virginia Tech. I believe, Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, Pete Thamel from ESPN had the report on that, and he also mentioned that Howell expected to call plays down there. We've seen Ty Howell as an interim offensive coordinator here in a couple different spots for Penn State. Sounds like he's going to get that shot down in Blacksburg, where James Franklin is keeping Brent Pry in town as his defensive coordinator. So a lot of getting the band back together vibes in Blacksburg for James Franklin and company. And then we got our first word of an opt-out for Penn State as they prepare for the Pinstripe Bowl. Zane Durant went public with his decision to end his career on Monday. A 3-year starter at defensive tackle, key voice in the locker room, a team captain this year as a senior defensive tackle, Zane Durant. So he will not be playing December 27th in the Bronx in Yankee Stadium against Clemson. But to this point, Terry Smith told us on Tuesday morning that there are no other opt-outs as of now. And I think that's very important to note, as of now. We'll see how the conversation goes as his team gets back into practice work. We heard from Dabo Sweeney this morning. There's a bunch more over at Lions247.com on the Pinstripe Bowl and everything there. But I didn't want to shortchange something you did, Daniel. You went out into the community yesterday evening and you saw some Penn State players giving back to that community. Tell us what you witnessed and what you heard.
Yeah, the West Shore Home, a big-time Penn State sponsor, booster, whatever you want to call it, partner. They hosted a Toys for Tots shopping spree with the U.S. Marines down at the Ollies on South Atherton in State College. There were a dozen Penn State players. I was told that they were only expecting to have 8 guys show up, but they ended up with 12, and it was mostly younger guys. They did this last year at Target in State College, and it skewed a lot of first, second, a couple third-year guys. But yeah, they set them loose in the store, tell them to fill up as many carts as possible. They have a number that they have a budget. And they just kind of go to town. It was pretty fun to watch. I talked to King Mac afterwards, and he said that he was trying to imagine that if he was 8 years old, walking around with essentially a blank check, like what would he want? What would he want to get? And so that's the headspace that he tried to put himself in. As he was filling up these carts, pushing them around. Some of the players that were there, King Mac, Kenny Woosley, I think 2 of the bigger personalities, on that team, 2 younger guys that, are a lot of fun to be around. You got to see some personality from, a Matt Henderson, Brian Kordovich, Brady O'Hara, in terms of that freshman class. Javen Williams, Chim Diono were around, Alex Tash, Cam Wallace, just kind of I think a pretty, wide selection of guys from the team. King Mac said opportunity for them to, take their helmets off, take their jerseys off, and be members of the community as they go around. They took some photos with some other shoppers that were there. There were some "We Are" chants. They took photos with, the employees. Just a cool event. I wrote it up. It was the end of a long day. These guys probably have a lot on their mind in terms of what's going to happen. I know that the meetings with Matt Campbell start, I think, on Wednesday. So there's going to be, a lot of change, a lot of uncertainty. But for a moment, they got to be members of the community. Giving back is a pretty cool thing. And, it'll be a nice thing to have on the calendar, I think, every December as you move forward.
Yeah, well, and how about them being human beings, right? And not being numbers on a tally sheet that people are worried about transferring. It's good, like the perspective of, hey, you know what? These are actually young guys, and whatever happens with them, you wish them nothing but the best, but you see where their hearts are. And it's nice to take a step back and how many guys are leaving in the portal and who's doing this and who's going to be with Franklin. So Grace was actually there shooting it, and she said it almost seemed as if for these guys, Daniel, as you mentioned, that they're going through all this and they weren't sure what was happening. It was like a nice way to just step away from everything and have some fun.
Yeah, I gave King Mac. I was just kind of, I talked to him, and I wasn't going to ask, like, are you playing in the Pinstripe Bowl? Like, are you transferring? So I just gave him the, like, just what's it like in the building? And he said, they had their meeting, they had their practice, and he said they're ready to beat Clemson. That was kind of his attitude, his mindset. And I was kind of like, oh, yeah, makes sense.
Clemson, Penn State, two teams that had really high expectations when things kicked off this fall. Didn't necessarily see themselves in New York City for Christmas, but that's where they'll spend it. Terry Smith said they'll make the trip up there December 22nd and then start preparing for that game on the 27th. Going to do a lot of fun stuff around the city. We'll be up there for game coverage as well. Between now and then, a lot coming your way at Lions247.com. Tyler Calvaruso back at it. Suddenly he has a lot to report about as Penn State's pursuing players again. So a lot on the recruiting and transfer portal portion of the conversation with us on our next episode of this podcast coming your way later in the week. For now, big thanks to Mark Brennan, Daniel Gowan, and then before them, you heard from Alec Bussey, who covers Iowa State for our 24/7 Sports Network. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.